Hey everybody, it's Todd Kelly with Seven Deadly Sins coming to you live from my living room, which is where I now socially distance myself from literally everybody who does not live in this house. And I'm coming at you as we are kicking off our Seven Deadly Sins quarantine series. As all of us are trying to stay physically distanced but stay socially connected as much as we can. For those of you who haven't seen our show live, our show is normally done in theaters or sometimes bars, music venues in front of crowds of people. And part of the reason that we do our shows is to try and make people in their day-to-day lives feel more connected to one another. And at this moment in time, it felt like that connection is needed so much more than it ever has before. And yet, we can't be physically together. So we're doing this series, which we'll have over the coming weeks and maybe even months. We're going to be bringing you stories and poetry and music and performance art and readings from all kinds of artists, writers, poets, musicians from all around Portland, all around the region, really all around the entire country. Folks have joined up and committed to doing this. We have literally now scores of amazing artists that have jumped on board with this, and we are incredibly excited. So if you haven't already and you want to find out more about it or keep track of it, you can go to our website, www.sevendeadlysinshow.org. You can like us or follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or our YouTube channel. And all of that information will be on our website as well. And as long as we're all doing this, I thought I would kick off with one just real quick story, if you'll bear with me, because usually I don't tell stories at my shows, but I'll tell you this one. I've been thinking a lot with this distancing about my parents. And there's this story that my dad used to tell. When I was growing, like, for me, sort of people say, like, when did you learn about storytelling? And the truth is, my sister and I grew up with it because my dad used to tell stories all the time at the dinner table, just like constantly. And it was those sort of things where he repeated them all the time, so we heard every one that he had like a million times. But the story that he used to tell that was my sister and my absolute favorite is the story about when he went on the second date with my mom. They'd gone on a first date. It was a blind date. They didn't say this to one another at the time, but during that date, each one of them said to themselves, this is the one. This is the person I'm going to spend my life with. And they had such a good time that at the end of the night, they agreed to go out the very next morning. And so my dad would tell the story where he would go and he would pick my mom up in the car, and they would give a kiss, and my sister and I would go like, yeah, that's gross, because parents kissing, am I right? So my dad would talk then, like he drove up the mountains in Wasatch. They lived in Salt Lake City, mountain range right by there. And he would go into this town to like get gas, but then he got on a road and he got lost. And he was embarrassed to be like lost with my mom, and he wanted to show that he was in control. So, but he was getting really, really angry, and all these cars, as they're driving by, they're like honking at him and they're like yelling at him, and he can't understand why until this one car pulls up beside him, and the guy rolls down his window, like the way they used to roll down. Kids, we used to roll down our window like this. And leaned out, and my dad said like this enormous guy, like broad shoulders, built like a linebacker, like maybe a foot and a half taller than my dad. And he head shaved, and the only facial hair he had was like one giant walrus mustache. And he yelled at my dad, "You're going the wrong way down a one-way road, you mother," and then says this word, which he wouldn't repeat to us. He would just say that it was a word that you did not ever say in front of a young lady. And so my dad rolled down his window and he reached out and he grabs the guy's mustache, sort of like one end in each hand, and he rips as hard as he can, and he pulls just all the hair right off the guy's face. And my sister and I cannot tell you how much we love this story. Like every time my dad would tell it, we would laugh hysterically at this thought of my dad standing up to this big guy that was bigger than him and like literally ripping his mustache off. And so we don't tell the story about where you ripped the guy's mustache off. And you know, and so my dad would, and he would, and then eventually you get to that time in your life, you know, where you don't do that at the dinner table anymore. You're talking about more grown-up things and sort of forgot about the story. And then years later, I'm like 29 years old and I'm on the East Coast because I'm engaged. I'm about to get married myself, and I am meeting my fiance's family for the very first time. And they take me out to dinner, all of them, and they want to know about my family, obviously, and they're saying, we just want to get a feel for what it was like growing up. Tell us a story about your family. And I just, without thinking, I just started telling the story. And he's like kissing, and driving, and people are honking, and my dad, and he like takes the, and he just rips, and the hair comes right out of his hand. And I'm looking around the room at this restaurant, and like everybody at the table is looking like they are not amused. Like they are, their expression on their face is like, what is our daughter getting herself into? And like for the very first time, like I go back and I replay that whole story as an adult in my head and not as a kid. And it's like, well, that's not funny. That's a little fucked up. And then I went through this, like I could never let go of it after that. Like, cause I always had this thing of like, what did that mean for my dad? Like what kind of person was my dad that he would have done that? And equally, sort of my mom, who was not violent at all and did not approve of violence. Like, why on earth did she go out with him again after that? Like, what was their relationship like at the time? And it's just like, I love my parents and I trusted my parents, but it was an odd question and I didn't want to know the answer. So I never talked about it with them until a number of years later, my dad passes away. And I go and I pick my sister up from the airport. She comes in. We go to my mom's house. We sit around my parents' kitchen table, and we're sort of catching up. It's been a real blow, and we hit that point. You know, you get where like everybody's just thinking their own thoughts, sort of staring off into the middle distance, and just without thinking about it, I hear myself saying, Mom, you know the story Dad used to tell about your second date, where he like grabbed the guy's facial hair? And my mom was like, yeah. I was like, I gotta know, like, why did you ever go out with him a second time? Or a third time, I guess, after that. And my mom just kind of laughed and said, well, the thing is that never happened. Your dad sort of said it one night, like just kind of being goofy, and you kids loved it, and you kept asking him to tell over and over, and so he did for years, but it never really happened. I was like, oh, well, that's good. That's good. And then after a few moments later, my mom sort of says, do you want to hear the real story about our actual second date? And so my sister and I settle in, and my mom tells us a story where my dad does indeed take her up to the Wasatch Mountains, and they're hiking, and they're having that thing where you walk for a while. You know that thing where you're not saying anything and the other person isn't saying anything, but it doesn't kind of matter because you both feel at ease? It's what they're both having. And they're both thinking, this is the person that I'm going to spend the rest of my life with. My mom does this thing, which I think for that time was a fairly brazen thing for a woman to do, where she reaches out her hand and she grabs my dad's left hand to hold it while they're walking, and my dad starts to pull his hand away like he doesn't want, and so my mom just grips it tighter, and she can feel, she says, instinctively how there's something about the hand that isn't right, that it feels wrong, and she doesn't know what it is. She just sort of intuitively knows that. And she's right, because it turns out my dad had polio as a kid, and he never talked about it ever. And he had this thing with his left hand, didn't really work, but he'd worked his whole young life trying to only use his hands in certain ways when he interacted with people, that no one would ever know that it couldn't really do anything, because that's not how he wanted people to see him. And my mom didn't know that. She just knew that there was something wrong with the hand, and that my dad was trying to break off the contact. And my mom made this decision. She said she held on to it with everything she had. She held on to it with her life. And to hear my mom say it, like everything that she was trying to pour in that moment was trying to communicate to my dad that she knew he was scared, and she didn't know why, and she didn't care. She just wanted him to know that she loved him, and she thought he was perfect, and she loved his broken hand. She thought that was perfect too. And I think about that story a lot now. Both the original version of their second date that I heard, where I got to be a kid and pretend that my dad was some sort of superhero. And I love the modern, real version that my mom told me, where I get to find out that my dad's great moment of showing strength in front of my mother was actually relaxing and being vulnerable and holding her hand back. And I think today, right now, that story resonates for me. In a time where I think there's so many people whose hands we want to hold, who we want to hug, who we want to touch, who we at least want to be near, and we can't. And that's what this story makes me think about today. So, there's that story. We got a lot more stories, music, poetry, readings, all kinds of stuff coming your way. So please, again, tune in. There's a lot of stuff coming, way better than this, way better than the story you just heard. I swear to God, I promise you, keep tuning in. Remember, follow us on social media. Until then, we'll see you guys soon. Stay strong, be safe, keep distancing physically, keep connecting socially. We'll see you soon.